The Seven Liberal Arts, A Study in Medieval Culture, by Paul Abelson, 1906. Part 5. Arithmetic. A. The general character of the Quadrivium. While it is undoubtedly true that the trivium, grammar, rhetoric, and logic, occupied the greater portion of time devoted to the study of the seven liberal arts, the traditional opinion that the real secular education of the Dark Ages was the trivium, and that the quadrivial or mathematical subjects were hardly pursued, is far from being historically correct. Such a statement could not be made with an approach to accuracy even in speaking of the university era when logic and philosophy were admittedly the essential studies. This misconception as to the scope of the mathematical subjects of the curriculum is, however, natural enough. The actual amount of mathematical knowledge during the period before the 12th century was so small that, until recently, it had been almost overlooked. Historians of the mathematical sciences have considered the age barren of interest. It is even claimed that the medieval mind had no aptitude whatever for mathematical science. But the absence of creative work in mathematics during the greater portion of our epoch does not itself argue a lack of instruction in the subject. Quite the contrary is the case. Looking at the question from all points of view, the evidence seems to point to but one conclusion: an extensive pursuit of the subjects of the quadrivium throughout the Middle Ages. In the first place, those personal experiences which give accurate illustrations of the study of the seven liberal arts invariably include the subjects of the quadrivium as well as of the trivium. Again, if we examine the facts bearing on the position of the Church on the question of mathematical instruction, we find that, from the days of Charlemagne, synod after synod enforced upon the clergy both a knowledge of the methods of Easter computation and of music. It is certain that in England, to cite but a single example, from the 8th century to the days of the Norman Conquest, no one was ordained to the priesthood who could not compute the date of Easter and teach it after the manner of the writings of the Venerable Bede. Beyond doubt, the Church was interested directly in at least three of the studies of the quadrivium: arithmetic, astronomy, and music. We should therefore expect no hostility in the instruction of the quadrivium in medieval schools. Moreover, if we examine the general condition of the schools of Europe in the Carolingian period and later, down to the intellectual revival of the 13th century, we can easily trace an unbroken record of continued interest in mathematical studies in all the famous monastic and cathedral schools of Europe. We find this existing at the schools of Fulda, Hersfeld, Reichenau, St. Gall, Augsburg, Mainz, Hildesheim, Speyer, Cologne, Stablo, Münster, Verdun, Corvey, Ratisbon, St. Emmeron, etc., and many other educational centers of the Holy Roman Empire. Still greater for these subjects was shown by many institutions of France and the Netherlands, such as those of Reims, Liège, Laubach, and others. We furthermore find that the great teachers of this period were nearly all famous, both for their teaching of mathematics and for contributions to the science of that subject. To cite but a few examples, we may mention Rabanus Maurus, Heinrich of Auxerre, Remigius of Auxerre, the three Notkers, Ratpert, Ermenrich, Heilprich, Tato, Hermanus Contractus, William of Herschel, etc. Researches have established the fact that all these possessed mathematical ability, were active in teaching mathematics, and in most cases even produced original works of merit on some of the quadrivial studies. The lack of scientific value in most of these treatises on the quadrivium accounts for the neglect to publish the large number of them found in the libraries of Europe. But even the incomplete records of textbooks of the quadrivium sufficiently indicate that there was a great deal of teaching done in these subjects. Much is generally made of the fact that up to the 12th century, the knowledge of the subject matter of mathematics was very slight, but even a most cursory examination of the contents of the textbooks in actual use during the period proves the incorrectness of the assertion that only the most elementary propositions in geometry, the method of calculating Easter, and the use of the abacus were the sole themes occupying the attention of the mathematicians of the age. We must be on our guard against estimating the achievements of the Middle Ages from the standpoint of our own time, when projections, the calculus, and theories of the composition of sound are the commonplaces of mathematical studies. In the succeeding chapters, which are to deal with the several subjects of the Quadrivium, the writer will endeavor to maintain the following theses. 1. The amount of knowledge imparted to the student of the Quadrivium was large in proportion to the amount of knowledge which Europe possessed of mathematical subjects at that time. This does not mean that the medieval teachers knew much mathematics, but that the schools fulfilled their mission and transmitted all the mathematical knowledge they possessed to future generations, and that the student was obliged to master this knowledge before he took up the advanced study of philosophy. 2. The standard of mathematical teaching in the Middle Ages in the well-known schools was very high. Although there is no evidence of creative mathematical ability in the early periods, the later centuries show advance in assimilation of new material. 3. The quantity and character of the mathematical instruction throughout the age improved pari passu with the advance of mathematical knowledge in the several subjects. 4. Even after the 13th century, when in the university period the Quadrivium was merged in the general course of philosophy in the School of Arts, mathematical studies were far from being neglected. Even then, when scholasticism held sway, the amount of instruction in mathematics kept pace with the gradual advancement of the sciences. B. Extent of knowledge. The arithmetical knowledge of the Middle Ages can be classified into 3 periods. During the first, ending with the 10th century, Europe possessed a very small amount of knowledge of the kind of arithmetic which was cultivated so much by the Greeks of the so-called Alexandrian Age. What was known comprised chiefly of the contents of the textbooks on arithmetic of the Neo-Pythagorean Nicomachus, composed about the close of the 1st century. During this time, the study of arithmetic was confined on its practical side to the computation of Easter, and on its theoretical side to a study of the properties of numbers. In the operations, the Roman abacus, a crude instrument, and the Roman numerals are used. During the second period, embracing the age from the end of the 10th century to the end of the 12th, a considerable advance can be noted. The use of the abacus, as modified by Gerbert, was extended, and complementary division and columnal computation, methods which obviated much of the digital computation of the earlier age, were common. During the third, the so-called algoristic epoch, embracing the years to the end of the Middle Ages, still greater progress can be noted. Arabic numerals and the zero came into use, while much of the Old Greek mathematics was reclaimed through Arabian translations. Although each period had its characteristic arithmetical method, quantum of knowledge, and range of instruction, it is not to be supposed that any definite line separating these stages could be traced. We shall find in our examination of the textbooks that these overlapped one another, and that textbooks characteristic of an earlier age continued in use to some extent in the succeeding age. The first period. 1. General character. Arithmetic in this stage is essentially the art of computation. It is almost exclusively devoted to the work of computing Easter so that during this age the terms computus and arithmetic became synonymous. Still, aside from this practical phase, a theoretical treatment of properties and relations of numbers was not absolutely wanting. In the theoretic arithmetic, the mystical and symbolic elements are very prominent. This was due, of course, to the fact that Nicomachus, whose book was the source of Boethius and the Christians, Isidore of Seville, Alcuin, Rabanus, and others, made much of such speculations. The method of reckoning was crude. The abacus was rarely used, while the cumbersome Roman notation made computation with large numbers well nigh impossible. In fact, no records of actual computations beyond 3 figures have been found. Roman fractions, wherever used, necessitated the aid of special multiplication tables based on the half system. If the textbooks in use afford any test, the total amount of arithmetical knowledge possessed by Western Europe during this period was small indeed. So small, in fact, as to make the latter rediscoveries and translations of the arithmetic of the Alexandrian school of mathematics seem like an addition of entirely new material to the stock of knowledge on this subject. 2. Textbooks. Strange as it may seem, the textbooks of the period do not treat of methods of operation. The few instances in which operations are incidentally given show plainly that a laborious mental process and the digital method were employed. The following are among the typical texts in use. 1. Capella's chapter on arithmetic in his De Nuptiis Philologiae et Mercurii is nothing more than the briefest abstract of the arithmetic of Nicomachus. Besides the allegorical introduction, the chapter consists of material on the properties and the mystic significance of number according to Pythagorean notions. The treatise owed its popularity to the fact that it formed a chapter of a convenient general textbook on the 7 liberal arts. 2. Boethius's De Institutione Arithmetica Libri Duo was used as the source of arithmetical knowledge in the Middle Ages for some 1,000 years. The book was a standard textbook even after the introduction of the Hindu system of notation and computation. Abridged, commented, and edited numberless times, it was still worth printing in the 16th century. What, then, were the contents of this remarkable work? Looking through the 80 folio columns and the 100 diagrams, one is surprised not to find a single rule of operation, only an almost endless classification of the properties of numbers. Of these there are triangular, perfect, excessive, defective, amicable, etc. There is a variety of kinds of even and odd numbers. Proportion and progression are not overlooked. The contents of the work would seem to indicate that Boethius's text was not for the use of pupils. It formed a teacher's guide on the subject. It also formed an adequate instruction to the study of the mystical interpretation of scriptural numbers, from which moral lessons were not infrequently deduced. 3. Cassiodorus's brief De Arithmetica is at best a condensed section of the work of Boethius. Nothing new is added. In 4 diagrams, the properties of numbers are classified, and each kind is defined and illustrated. One finds nothing in the work in the way of information on practical methods. 4. Isidore of Seville's brief chapter on arithmetic follow the same lines as that of Cassiodorus. It is a mere 4-fold classification of numbers in regards to their properties and relations. The author adds some absurd remarks on the derivation of the Latin arithmetical nomenclature and some rapturous expressions about the importance of numbers. In this work, also, we look in vain for any single sentence about methods and rules of operations. 5. The Venerable Bede's De Temporum Ratione, an elaborate text on the methods of computing Easter, is the first book of this period to touch upon the subject of practical computation. It is therefore not surprising that this work should have become a standard for many centuries to come. 6. The same author's Liber de Ratione Computi is of similar character, but more condensed in form. 7. Alcuin's De Cursu et Saltu Lunae ac Bissexto is likewise a work on the computus. Its contents, however, is astronomical rather than arithmetical. 8. Rabanus Maurus's Liber de Computo is perhaps the most complete and the most typical book of the period under discussion. The 96 chapters of the work treat fully and concisely of all that is necessary for a complete knowledge of Easter reckoning. To be sure, the inevitable multiform classification of the properties and relations of number is there, but less than one column is given to the subject. The rest of the text is devoted to the Greek system of notation, the divisions of time, the names of Greek and Roman months, names of planets, facts about the moon, the solstice, the equinox, indications, epochs, and similar astronomical phenomena involved in the study of the computus. The lunar cycles and the method of finding Easter are explained after the plan of Bede. As one would expect, the principal portion of the whole work is the part devoted to the method of Easter reckoning. It is significant that in the introduction of the work, a chapter on digital reckoning and practical Roman symbols is given. Still more significant is the omission of the rules for the 4 operations. From this, it would seem, then, that the computation was done mainly in the head, perhaps with the aid of an elaborate system of finger reckoning, and that a knowledge of the 4 elementary operations with whole numbers was assumed in the study of the computus. In all respects, the work of Maurus may stand as typical of the arithmetical knowledge and teaching of this period. The great influence of the Praeceptor Germaniae of itself argues for a widespread use of his work, and numerous textbooks on the computus, anonymous and otherwise, were based on his treatise. Besides these textbooks, all of which show the character ascribed to this period, there are some exceptional works on arithmetic composed in this epoch, but their existence and use in no way weaken the conclusions which have been formulated as to the general character of the instruction in arithmetic in this early period of the Middle Ages. Of unique interest as showing methods of division and some fractional work are the following short works mistakenly attributed to Bede. 1. De numerorum divisione libellus, 2. De loquela per gestum digitorum et temporum ratione libellus, and 3. De unciarum ratione. The origin of these little treatises cannot be traced back later than the 10th century. It can, therefore, be assumed that they indicate a slow advance in arithmetical knowledge. This material was to serve as a foundation for Gerbert's achievements in the field of arithmetic. The second period. 1. General character. The point of departure for tracing the progress of the study and teaching of arithmetic during this period can be found in the epoch-making mathematical achievements of Gerbert. The questions as to the precise value of Gerbert's contributions to the development of the science of arithmetic is still an open one. According to some, he is to be credited only with the introduction of columnal computation in Western Europe. Others go so far as to attribute to him the introduction of the Arabic system. On the other hand, Cantor, the Nestor of the historians of mathematics, maintains that Gerbert was absolutely unfamiliar with the Arabic system. There is, however, substantial unanimity on the following points. 1. That Gerbert and his disciples, notably Bernaldinus, improved the abacus and extended its use by the introduction of special kinds of appliques, place symbols at the top of each column of the abacus. 2. That he and his disciples did not employ the zero. 3. That in Jalbert's book we have the first work on the method of computing with the abacus. 4. That Gerbert, first to use the method of complementary division, made possible all the 4 operations on the abacus. For the purposes of our inquiry, one other fact in regard to Gerbert is pertinent. He taught the Quadrivium with marked success at the school of Reims from 972 to 982, and an extended account of his methods is in existence. Jalbert's 2 works, the Regulae de Abici Numerorum Rationibus and the Fragment de Numerorum Abici Rationibus, can thus be taken as typical of arithmetical textbooks from the 10th to the beginning of the 13th century. Examining these treatises, we find that the process employed in addition, subtraction, and multiplication are much like those used in modern times, while the process of division, the subject matter of his second and lesser work, is entirely different from the modern method. Compared with the Arabian system, Jalbert's methods of division have been considered not improperly about as complicated as human ingenuity could make them. This opinion is confirmed by the name divisio ferrea, given to his method after the introduction of the Hindu system, which was called the divisio aurea. In the days of Gerbert, writers on arithmetic were generally called abacists. With the introduction of the Hindu methods through Arabian influence, this term came to be restricted to those who clung to the older methods, namely 1. The use of the abacus, 2. Roman notation, 3. Roman duodecimal fractions, 4. The absence of zero in the calculation, and 5. The failure to deal with the method of extracting the square root. The better methods of the algoristic school, as the writers of the next period were called, did not necessarily supplant the work of the abacists. There was indeed a contest waged between the abacist school, sometimes erroneously known as the Boethian school, and the new Arabian school. The intrinsic superiority of the newer system did not necessarily cause the immediate disappearance of textbooks based on the older. As textbooks of Boethian arithmetic were printed even as late as the 16th century, so editions of works on the old abacal system continued in use long after the triumph of the algorist. 2. Textbooks. Turning to a consideration of the textbooks of the period, we find many printed editions of these. Only the typical ones, those which in their day were considered famous, need, however, be mentioned here. 1. Hermanus Contractus, a monk teaching at Reichenau in the first half of the 11th century, is the author of a Liber de Abaco, a briefer treatise than either of Jalbert's works, but avowedly based upon them. 2. Rudolph of Laon, in the 12th century, composed a similar work. 3. Johannes de Garlandia, the author of the treatise on the Computus, also composed a textbook on the abacus. The preparation of these 2 separate texts by the same writer is significant. It shows that in his day, the scope of arithmetic had widened, and that there was a complete separation of the Computus from the arithmetic proper. The third period. 1. General character of mathematical knowledge. The consideration of the third, the algoristic period arithmetic, brings us almost into the midst of the later university era. Although the Quadrivium was merged into the general course offered under the Faculty of Arts, yet arithmetic, both theoretical and practical, was studied more than in the earlier period. This was, of course, due to the increase in the quantum of knowledge of the subject. The characteristics of the algoristic arithmetic are 1. The use of the Hindu-Arabic system of notation, 2. The system of local value, 3. The use of the zero, 4. The entire discarding of the abacus, 5. The combined use of symbols and numbers, in reality a combination of algebra and arithmetic as these terms are understood today, and 6. The introduction into Western Europe of a vast amount of arithmetical material from the East by means of Latin translations from Arabian sources. While the general tendency of this period was to approach the study of arithmetic from its practical and scientific sides, the mystical aspects of the subject, so popular in the earlier periods, are by no means neglected. The fantastic treatment of the properties of numbers is still common in this age. Thus, the beginning of the 13th century marks the introduction of the Arabian system of notation and its adoption in place of both the Roman notation and the abacus. This fundamental revolution was brought about only gradually. The transition between the period of the abacus and that of the algorism can be traced in the translated literature of the Hindu-Arabian arithmetic of the following well-known mathematicians of the 12th century. 1. Adelard of Bath, who wrote Regulae Abaci about 1130. To him also is ascribed the Cambridge anonymous manuscript Algorithme de Numero Indorum. 2. Abraham ibn Ezra, whose treatise on arithmetic was written early in the 12th century. 3. John of Seville, who about 1140 composed his Algorismus. 4. Gerard of Cremona, who in the latter part of the 12th century prepared an Algorismus. And 5. The brief anonymous work on algorism, composed about the year 1200 in South Germany. These transitional works, however, composed before the rise of the universities and during the period of the decline of the monastic and cathedral schools, while establishing the historical sequence in this particular study, cannot be taken as typical textbooks of our period. Their consideration, therefore, need not detain us. They only served one admirable purpose. They introduced the Hindu-Arabian system among the mathematicians of Europe, and thus paved the way for later works. It is true, nevertheless, that in the history of arithmetical as well as of all mathematical studies, the early years of the 13th century are truly epoch-making. For after that time, there was a constant stream throughout the century of translations and adaptations of both Arabian and Greek mathematical books. In the field of arithmetic, the introduction into Europe of this new knowledge produced two different effects. 1. Its utilization and extension as applied to commerce, and 2. The adoption of the Arabian system of notation in the academical study of mathematics. The first resulted in an extraordinary development in the practical aspects of arithmetic and of portions of algebra in the commercial centers of Italy, England, and Germany during the next 3 centuries. The chief representative of this tendency was Leonard of Pisa, the son of a merchant. His voluminous Liber Abaci, composed in 1202, presented to the world an amount of practical and theoretical knowledge of arithmetic and algebra which may be considered remarkable even from the standpoint of our modern age. But the influence of his book on the study of arithmetic in the universities was not perceptible, even in his own country, Italy. In spite of its importance from the standpoint of the general history of mathematics, it need not be considered here. The introduction of the study of arithmetic as a science into the universities was obviously of the greatest importance. Here also a great representative writer can be named. Jordanus Nemorarius, a Dominican monk, did as much to make the science of arithmetic acceptable within the tradition-worshipping medieval schools as did Leonardo of Pisa to make that convenient accomplishment popular among the merchants and traders of Europe. Nemorarius's treatises, which concern us here, are 1. Algorithmus Demonstratus, a brief elementary treatise on practical computations, 2. Arithmetica Demonstrata, a work on the theory of numbers, and 3. De Numeris Datis, a treatise on algebra. Their abstract and scientific character is fully established by the fact that general symbols are used. All business methods being rigidly excluded, we have in these works the material exactly suited for the academic study of the subject. 2. Scope. After this survey of the field of arithmetical knowledge which Western Europe possessed at this time, the question suggests itself: how much of this material was actually used in the teaching of arithmetic? An examination of the records of arithmetical instruction in the universities should give the answer. Turning then to these records, we find the following typical conditions. At Paris, mathematics was very much neglected. The requirement for the MA degree in 1366 mentioned vaguely that the student attend lectures on some mathematical books. Nevertheless, from the fact that Sacrobosco, the author of an algorithm based on Jordanus, lectured on mathematics at the University of Paris before 1256, it may be assumed that at least the material contained in the Arithmetic of Jordanus was most likely taught before 1366, the date of record referred to. In Bologna, where mathematics was cultivated much more than at Paris, there was in the Faculty of Arts a chair in arithmetic. A course on the Algorism de Minutiis et Integris, the material of Jordanus's Algorithmus Demonstratus, was definitely prescribed. The statutes of the University of Prague for the year 1367 require for the MA degree the Algorismus, which, according to a schedule of lectures for that year, could be learned in 3 weeks. Evidently, this provision refers to the study of some such books as Sacrobosco's, that is, the Elements of Practical Arithmetic. At the same university, we find among the requirements for the MA degree the study of some arithmetic. Other records show that at this university, the Algorismus and the Arithmetica Accurata were studied. Obviously, the distinction here is between the elements of practical and of theoretical arithmetic. The University of Vienna was throughout its career in the Middle Ages as renowned in mathematics as was Paris in philosophy. Even disputations on mathematical subjects were held there. While data relating to the study of arithmetic at Vienna could therefore not be taken as typical of the conditions obtaining at other universities, nevertheless, the information we possess on the subject when taken in connection with the other evidence is illuminating. The lecture schedule for the years 1391 to 1399 shows that there were given at Vienna different sets of lectures on 1. Algorismus de Integris, 2. Algorismo de Minutiis, 3. Computus Physicus, 4. Astronomical Fractions, 5. Arithmetica et Proportiones, and 6. Arithmetica. When we consider the care that was taken to avoid competition by the duplication of courses, we may assume that courses were given on elementary and theoretical arithmetic and algebra, the subject matter of Jordanus's work. The same distinction between the algorismus, that is, the practical elements of arithmetic, and arithmetica, the theoretical, is further emphasized in the records of the conditions in the 15th century. It appears that there were then grades of compensation paid to the lecturer for different kinds of lectures on arithmetic. The Arithmetica lectures were worth twice the amount of the lectures on algorism, though the number of the lectures required in both courses was the same. Again, It seems significant that the honorarium for lectures on arithmetic was equal to the compensation for the same number on a kindred theoretical mathematical study, music. At Leipzig, the daughter of Prague, the same conditions prevailed. Most significant, perhaps, is the fact that in the University of Cologne, which was founded in 1389 on the Paris Plan, the requirements for the MA degree in 1398 are identical with those of Vienna. Conditions substantially similar to those described existed at Erfurt, Heidelberg, Freiburg, Oxford, and even in the Italian universities Padua and Pisa, where the work of Leonardo of Pisa had no influence even in the 15th century. The evidence produced indicates pretty clearly the scope of the instruction in arithmetic in the European universities. Since the material of this instruction was apparently identical with the contents of the three described books of Jordanus Numerarius, we are justified in inferring that the scientific knowledge of arithmetic at that time was fully represented in the university instruction, and nearly all of it was prescribed for graduation in the MA degree. 3. Textbooks. Having determined the character of the contents of arithmetical textbooks of this period, we may proceed to an examination of the texts used at the universities. 1. First among these in importance, since it was the most widely used of all for some 3 centuries, is that of the Englishman John Hollywood, known as Sacrobosco, whose Tractatus de Arte Numerandi, or Algorismus, was reprinted a number of times under various names. It is but an excerpt from Jordanus's Algorismus Demonstratus. It contains the rules of arithmetic without the demonstrations or illustrations, and fractions are omitted altogether. The work is in fact barely more than an explanation of the 9 operations of arithmetic as laid down by Jordanus. The rules of multiplication are given in verse. The character of the work readily determines its place in the curriculum. It was simply used as a guide, a text from which the elements of arithmetic were taught before the beginning of the more pretentious study of theoretical arithmetic. 2. What Sacrobosco did to introduce Jordanus's Algorismus into the universities, other writers did for his other 2 theoretical works. One of these is Thomas Bradwardine, 1290 to 1349, whose Arithmetica Speculativa covered the ground of the advanced arithmetic of Jordanus. 3. Sacrobosco and Bradwardine, then, were the adapters of Jordanus's practical and theoretical arithmetic. In the same way, Nicholas Erasmus, a student and later, in the middle of the 14th century, a teacher at the University of Paris, made available Jordanus's arithmetical and algebraic material, especially the portions dealing with the fractions and the syncopated algebra. His Algorismus Proportionum was unmistakably based on the work of Jordanus. That treatise is more than a mere work on fractions and proportions. In fact, in the use of fractional exponents, Erasmus marks an advance on his source. 4. John de Mury, another French mathematician of the century, labored to simplify Boethius and Jordanus. His Arithmetica Speculativa was based on these authors. Its wide use is attested by the large number of editions in existence now. It was a standard work on theoretical arithmetic. 5. Johann von Gmunden's Tractatus de Minutiis Physicis is the typical textbook used in the German universities during the 15th century. The author, in his day a famous professor at the University of Vienna, was the first teacher in Europe who lectured on mathematics as a specialty. Before his time, as is well known, it had been the custom to have the professors lecture in turn on the different subjects in their respective faculties. Johann von Gmunden taught at Vienna from 1412 to 1417, both the Algorismus de Integris and the De Minutiis. In his lectures, he used the texts popular in his day. On integral arithmetic, he read Sacrobosco. On fractions, some current commentator on Jordanus, and on astronomical fractions, his own Tractatus de Minutiis Physicis. 6. Johann von Purbach's Algorismus for the student was widely used in Germany in the generation following the activity of Johann von Gmunden. The popularity of this book was due to the fact that its author was famous as the successor of Johann von Gmunden at the University of Vienna. As a textbook, the treatise was an improvement on Sacrobosco, whose work it aimed to supplant. 7. We may close our examination of the textbooks of this period with the mention of the Algorismus de Integris of Prostocimo de Beldemandi, who in 1410 lectured on that subject at Padua. This text, in all respects similar to that of Sacrobosco, shows that even by the middle of the 15th century, the universities of Italy had not been influenced by the work of Leonardo of Pisa. Apparently, at this time, they still followed the special path of what may be called academic arithmetic. With the advance in the knowledge of universal arithmetic, the term applied to algebra, there was a tendency toward the end of the 15th century to put the elementary arithmetic and proportion outside of the course of requirements for the MA degree. This tendency explains the significance of a notice relating to Heidelberg for the year 1443. The study of algorism and de proportionibus is there put in a class of electives quos non apportet scholares formaliter in scholis ratione alicuius gradus audivisse. These lectures, for which fees were charged, were evidently given as an extra course or to help students to brush up. Thus the requirements in arithmetic at the universities had appreciably risen since the days of the 14th century. In the present chapter, the aim has been not only to present a brief account of the character and scope of the instruction of arithmetic as one of the studies in the curriculum of the 7 liberal arts, but also to give the reader an insight into the nature of the evidence on which the writer has based the views stated in the introductory paragraphs. Although at times the varied and elusive character of the data gathered almost defied analysis, still the inquiry has clearly established the historical continuity of the study of arithmetic in the scheme of medieval higher education. There can be no doubt that at all times, medieval schools taught all that their respective generations knew of arithmetic, that the teachers of arithmetic in the schools were often the famous mathematicians of their day, that this teaching, since it kept pace with the increase in the knowledge of the subject, was progressive in character, and that at no time, not even in the barren generation at the close of the Middle Ages, when the scholastic education had outlived its usefulness, did arithmetic cease to be a subject of study in the arts faculties of the medieval universities. End of The 7 Liberal Arts, A Study in Medieval Culture, Part 5, Arithmetic, by Paul Abelson, 1906. Read by Dan Attrell. If you would like to support more work such as this, please visit patreon.com/themodernhermeticist. And above all, thank you for listening.